You know your marriage is in trouble when your wife's friends start treating your living room like a courtroom, and you're always the one on trial. These women had turned their weekly coffee meetings into strategic planning sessions for Operation Upgrade My Wife's Husband. The subtle digs about my salary, like Maria's comment about how nice it must be to have summers off as a teacher, the pointed questions about my career ambitions, and the way they would exchange glances when I walked through the room should have been red flags. But I thought it was all just harmless neighborhood drama, until the day they looked me straight in the eye and delivered their final verdict about my worth as a husband. The Coffee Club Commandos assemble. Let me introduce you to the cast of characters who turned my Tuesday afternoons into a psychological thriller. First, we had Monica, the unofficial leader, who carried herself like she was running for mayor of the subdivision and had this talent for asking questions that sounded innocent but felt like interrogations. She wore those oversized sunglasses even indoors and had perfected the art of the concerned head tilt while delivering what felt like performance reviews of my life choices. Then there was Patricia, who specialized in backhanded compliments and could make you feel grateful for being insulted, which honestly was probably her most impressive skill. She had this way of saying things like, "Oh, how nice that you get summers off as a teacher," while somehow making it sound like I was a lazy deadbeat instead of someone who worked with teenagers all day. The third member of this suburban tribunal was Jennifer, who functioned as the group's research department and always seemed to know exactly how much everyone in the neighborhood paid for their cars, their vacations, and their kitchen renovations. She would drop these little facts into conversation. Like, "Oh, I heard Rebecca spent $15,000 on her bathroom remodel while looking directly at our guest bathroom door like she was conducting a home appraisal." Last but definitely not least was Amanda, who serves as the group's motivational speaker, but specialized in the kind of motivation that made you question every decision you had ever made in your entire life. What started as innocent Tuesday coffee dates slowly transformed into something that felt more like a weekly board meeting, where my marriage was the struggling company they were trying to fix. At first, these gatherings looked exactly like what you would expect from a group of suburban moms getting together to catch up and complain about their lives. They would sit around our kitchen table with their matching water bottles and talk about their kids and their yoga classes and where they were planning to go for their next girls trip. But underneath all that normal friendship stuff, something else was happening that took me months to fully understand. I initially wrote off these meetings as typical neighborhood socializing because, honestly, what harm could four women drinking coffee and eating pastries possibly do to anyone? Sarah seemed happy to have friends nearby, and I figured it was good for her to have people to talk to during the day, while I was at school teaching algebra to teenagers who would rather be literally anywhere else. The warning signs started small and easy to dismiss, like how Sarah would suddenly go quiet when I walked into the kitchen during their meetings, or how the conversation would shift from whatever they were discussing to ask me about my day in a way that felt more like a job interview than casual interest. The transformation in my wife after each coffee session was like watching someone return from a meeting with new ideas about how unsatisfying their current life situation really was. She would spend the rest of Tuesday evening and most of Wednesday in this weird reflective mood, where she would make comments about how nice it must be to have enough money to redecorate whenever you want, or how some people are just naturally more ambitious than others. When I asked her what brought on these philosophical observations, she would claim she was just thinking out loud. But there was definitely a pattern forming that connected directly to whatever topics had been covered during that day's coffee summit. These women had created their own little ecosystem of competition and comparison, where every aspect of their lives became fair game for evaluation and judgment. I had developed this intricate system of ranking everything from their husbands' jobs to their vacation destinations to their children's extracurricular activities, and somehow my wife had gotten sucked into playing along with their elaborate game of keeping score. The unspoken rules of their social hierarchy were more complex than anything I dealt with in my classroom and way more brutal than any teenage drama I had witnessed. I started to realize that something more serious was happening when I began feeling like an intruder in my own house every Tuesday at exactly 2 p.m. The way these women would look at me when I came home early or needed to grab something from the kitchen made me feel like I was interrupting some kind of classified meeting where my presence was not welcome. They would pause their conversation and wait for me to leave before continuing, and I could feel their eyes following me as I moved through what was supposed to be my own living space. What I didn't realize at the time was that they had actually started timing these meetings to coincide with my usual arrival home from school. This wasn't accidental scheduling, but a deliberate strategy to create these awkward encounters where I would walk into a room full of women who would suddenly stop talking and stare at me like I had interrupted something important. They were using these moments to reinforce whatever narrative they had been building about me during their conversations, and my uncomfortable presence became part of their evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with our marriage dynamic. The psychological warfare happening in my living room was disguised so well as normal friendship activities that I started questioning whether I was imagining the whole thing or just being paranoid about innocent conversations between neighbors. These women could discuss the most cutting personal topics while maintaining the same tone they would use to talk about the weather, and they had mastered the art of planting seeds of dissatisfaction while appearing to offer support and encouragement. I knew something had fundamentally shifted when I started timing my arrivals home to avoid overlapping with their weekly meetings, because being in the same room with these women had become genuinely uncomfortable. They had this way of making me feel like every word I said was being evaluated and cataloged for future reference. And I could tell they were building some kind of case against me, even though I had no idea what the charges were supposed to be. The first clear sign that these women had an agenda beyond casual friendship came when Sarah started asking me questions that sounded suspiciously similar to the kinds of things I overheard them discussing during their meetings. She wanted to know why I had never considered going back to school for administration, or whether I ever thought about what it would be like to make more money, or if I was happy with where my career was heading. These weren't the kind of random questions that come up naturally in marriage conversations, and I could tell someone had been coaching her on what to ask me. What I was witnessing was the early stages of a carefully orchestrated campaign. Operation Upgrade Husband begins. Once these women had established their beachhead in my living room, they launched what I can only describe as a precision military operation designed to convince my wife that her current life situation was completely unacceptable. Rebecca handled the big picture disappointment by asking Sarah questions like, "Don't you ever wonder what your life would be like if you had made different choices while maintaining this expression of deep concern that made it seem like she was genuinely worried about my wife's happiness and fulfillment?" Jessica specialized in the art of helpful suggestions that were actually devastating critiques of our entire lifestyle, wrapped up in friendly advice. She would say things like, "Sarah, if you ever wanted to redecorate this place, I know this amazing interior designer who could really transform the space." And then she would pause and look around our living room like she was mentally calculating how much money it would take to make it acceptable to civilized human beings. The way she delivered these comments made it impossible to call her out because technically she was being supportive and offering to help. But the underlying message was crystal clear that our house was embarrassing and needed professional intervention. Maria brought her talent for strategic comparison shopping to every conversation, and she had this supernatural ability to work detailed financial information into casual discussion. She would mention how her husband had surprised her with a weekend trip to Napa Valley and then ask Sarah, "When was the last time you and your husband went somewhere really special together?" And Sarah would mention our planned camping trip. Maria would get this look on her face like Sarah had just told her we were planning to live in a cardboard box for entertainment. She never directly criticized our vacation choices, but she made it clear that camping was what people did when they couldn't afford real travel. Linda served as the group's life coach and relationship expert, even though her own marriage seemed to consist mainly of spending her husband's money and complaining about how busy his real estate business kept him. She would listen to Sarah talk about our weekend plans or something funny I'd said and then respond with observations like, "It's so important to be with someone who challenges you to grow as a person," or "Don't you think you deserve to be with someone who shares your ambitions?" These comments always sounded supportive on the surface, but they contained the subtle implication that I was holding Sarah back from reaching her full potential as a human being. The genius of their approach was how they turned marriage advice into a competitive sport where each woman tried to outdo the others in terms of how much concern they could express for Sarah's situation. They would build on each other's comments and create these elaborate discussions about what Sarah deserved in life and how important it was for women to have standards and not settle for less than they were worth. Every conversation somehow circled back to this central theme that Sarah was too good for her current circumstances and that she had options she wasn't considering. I started connecting the dots between their Tuesday meetings and Sarah's sudden interest in questioning everything about our life together, when I realized she was using almost the exact same phrases these women had used during their discussions. She would ask me questions like, don't you think we should be more financially ambitious? Or do you ever feel like you're not living up to your potential? And I could hear Rebecca's voice coming out of my wife's mouth. It's like watching someone who had been reprogrammed by a committee of suburban relationship consultants who had decided our marriage was a problem that needed fixing. These women had perfected the art of plausible deniability to the point where they could systematically destroy someone's confidence in their relationship while maintaining complete innocence about their intentions. If anyone had accused them of trying to break up my marriage, they would have been genuinely shocked and offended because in their minds they were just being good friends who cared about Sarah's happiness. They had convinced themselves that their manipulation was actually a form of intervention designed to help Sarah see her situation more clearly. The specific techniques they used were sophisticated enough to work on someone with a PhD in psychology because they exploited the natural trust that exists between friends and made their victim feel guilty for questioning their motives. They would say things like, we just want you to be happy, Sarah, and if you're happy, then we're happy for you. But then they would spend the next hour explaining all the reasons why Sarah couldn't possibly be truly happy in her current situation. They made her feel like she was being defensive and unreasonable if she tried to argue that she was actually satisfied with her life. I began to feel like I was being evaluated by a panel of judges who had already decided I was guilty of the crime of being insufficiently impressive for their friend. Every time I walked through the living room during their meetings, I could sense them taking mental notes about my appearance, my body language, and whatever I happened to be doing at that moment. If I was wearing old clothes, they would exchange glances that said, see, he doesn't even care about how he looks. And if I was dressed nicely, they would find some other aspect of my behavior to catalog as evidence of my inadequacy. The psychological pressure of being constantly assessed and found wanting by people who barely knew me started affecting how I acted in my own house because I knew that everything I did would be analyzed and discussed after I left the room. I started second-guessing normal husband behavior like grabbing a snack from the kitchen or asking Sarah about her day. Because these women had created an atmosphere where my mere existence felt like an intrusion on their important work of helping my wife understand how much better her life could be. Their strategy was working exactly as planned because Sarah started expressing ideas and concerns that had never occurred to her before she joined their weekly evaluation sessions. She began talking about how some of her college friends had married men who were more successful, or how it might be nice to live somewhere with better restaurants and cultural opportunities. These thoughts were being planted and watered every Tuesday afternoon by women who had appointed themselves as experts on what Sarah deserved in life. The most effective part of their manipulation was how they made Sarah feel like she was discovering these dissatisfactions on her own, rather than having them suggested by outside influences. They would ask leading questions and then sit back and let Sarah draw her own conclusions about how disappointing her current situation really was. By the time she started parroting their talking points, she genuinely believed these concerns had originated from her own reflection rather than from months of systematic programming by her concerned friends. But their most devastating weapon was still being loaded and aimed directly at the foundation of everything I thought I had built with my wife. The salary shame Olympics. That weapon turned out to be their ability to turn financial comparison into a blood sport where they competed to see who could make me feel like the biggest failure as a provider. Rebecca would casually mention how her lawyer husband had just booked them a 2-week European vacation while looking at our refrigerator magnets from our weekend trip to the state park like she was studying artifacts from a lost civilization. She had this talent for making our modest lifestyle sound like we were living in poverty even though we owned our house and had never missed a bill payment in our entire marriage. The way Maria would say things like, oh, how nice that teachers get summers off, made my schedule sound like I was chronically unemployed, rather than working with teenagers who thought algebra was a form of medieval torture. Jessica specialized in the concern friend routine, where she would express worry about our financial future while simultaneously showcasing how much better her situation was compared to ours. She would say things like, I just worry about you two not having enough saved for retirement while wearing jewelry. that probably cost more than my monthly salary and carrying a purse that could have funded a small country's educational budget. Her husband apparently made so much money from his restaurant that she could afford to be concerned about everyone else's financial planning while spending more on lunch than most people spend on groceries for a week. Linda had perfected the art of the casual financial flex and could work her husband's real estate commissions into any conversation regardless of the topic. If we were talking about the weather, she would mention how their second home was experiencing different temperatures, and if we discussed weekend plans, she would bring up how well her husband's business was doing and how they were thinking about buying a boat. She made it sound like she was just sharing updates about her life, but every story contained detailed information about expensive purchases that highlighted the massive gap between their lifestyle and ours. Maria approached financial shaming from the motivational angle and would deliver speeches about ambition and success that were clearly directed at me, even though she was pretending to address the entire group. She would talk about how important it was for couples to push each other toward greater achievements and how some people are naturally more driven than others, while looking in my direction like she was a life coach who had identified the weak link in our marriage. Her doctor husband apparently was constantly expanding his practice, which gave her the authority to lecture everyone else about professional growth and financial success. The most infuriating part of their financial superiority performances was how they would express fake concern about our budget limitations while making it clear that money was never an issue in their own lives. Rebecca would ask Sarah if we were planning any big trips this year, and when Sarah mentioned we were thinking about camping, she would get this expression like Sarah had just announced. We were planning to live in a cardboard box for entertainment. Then she would offer to help us find deals on vacation packages because she knew this great travel agent who specialized in budget-friendly options for people in our situation. I started keeping track of how many times these women could mention money in a single conversation, and the numbers were honestly impressive in the worst possible way. Linda could reference her husband's latest commission, her designer handbag, her expensive gym membership, and their upcoming kitchen renovation, all within the span of discussing what to bring to a neighborhood potluck dinner. She had this supernatural ability to turn any topic into an opportunity to showcase their financial advantages, while making it seem like she was just making conversation. Sarah started absorbing their financial shame messaging and began expressing embarrassment about things she had never cared about before these women entered our lives. She would make comments about how our car was getting old or how it might be nice to eat at restaurants more often, and I could hear their voices coming out of her mouth. The woman who had once told me she loved that I chose teaching because I wanted to make a difference in kids' lives was now questioning whether I should look for higher paying careers that would give us more financial flexibility. These women could make a teacher's salary sound like a personal moral failing rather than a career choice, and they had perfected a delivery to make it seem like they were being supportive rather than judgmental. Maria would say things like, "Teaching is such important work. It's just too bad society doesn't value educators more financially," while shaking her head like she was mourning the tragic waste of my potential. The subtext was crystal clear that I had chosen a noble but ultimately foolish profession that would never provide the kind of lifestyle Sarah deserved. Their helpful suggestions about our financial situation were actually detailed critiques wrapped up in friendly advice, and they grew bolder with each successful coffee meeting. Jessica would suggest that I consider getting my administrative certification so I could become a principal and make more money, or maybe look into tutoring on the side to supplement our income. These recommendations sounded reasonable on the surface, but they carried the underlying message that my current salary was completely inadequate for supporting a wife properly. I watched Sarah start to internalize their message that my career was something to be ashamed of rather than proud of. And it felt like watching someone slowly poisoned by ideas that contradicted everything she'd once believed about our life together. She began asking me questions about whether I ever regretted not going into business or law, and whether I thought we would ever be able to afford the kind of lifestyle her friends had. These conversations felt like job performance reviews, where I was constantly being evaluated and found wanting by standards I had never agreed to meet. The final proof that their financial shaming campaign was working came when Sarah started apologizing to her friends for our modest lifestyle choices and making excuses for why we couldn't keep up with their expensive social activities. She would say things like, "We're trying to be more responsible with our spending when declining invitations to costly restaurants," as if our budget limitations were a character flaw rather than a normal part of life for people who work in public service. What hurt most was watching the woman who had once been proud of our ability to live within our means, now treating our financial situation like a shameful secret that needed constant explanation. But the real genius of their operation wasn't just the financial pressure they applied. It was how they managed to deliver these devastating attacks while maintaining complete innocence about their intentions. These women had turned passive aggression into an art form, and watching them operate was like observing master craftsmen who could demolish someone's self-worth while maintaining the sweetest possible expressions on their faces. Rebecca had perfected what I can only describe as the concerned friend delivery system, where she could say the most devastating things about my life choices while sounding like she was offering helpful career counseling. She would tilt her head and furrow her brow and say things like, "I just worry that teaching might not provide the kind of security Sarah needs for her future," while making it sound like she had spent sleepless nights concerned about our financial planning rather than systematically trying to convince my wife that I was a poor provider. Maria specialized in the backhanded compliment wrapped in genuine-sounding praise, and she could make you feel grateful for being insulted, which was honestly the most impressive manipulation technique I had ever witnessed in real life. She would say things like, "It's so admirable how you're passionate about education, even though it's not the most lucrative field," while smiling like she had just given me the highest possible compliment. The way she delivered these comments made it impossible to call her out, because technically she was praising my dedication to helping students learn. But the underlying message was crystal clear that my career choice was financially irresponsible and ultimately selfish. Jessica had mastered the art of strategic timing and could deliver her most cutting observations at precisely the moment when I would be least likely to respond or defend myself. She would wait until I was carrying groceries or heading out the door, and then make comments about her husband's expensive jewelry while glancing at Sarah's modest wedding ring, or mention how teachers probably don't understand business or money, with this little laugh that made it sound like a harmless joke rather than a calculated insult. The timing was so perfect that by the time I processed what she had actually said, the moment had passed, and responding would have made me look defensive or like I was starting an argument over nothing. The most infuriating aspect of their communication strategy was how they coordinated their efforts to present a united front of concern rather than individual opinions, which made me feel like I was being evaluated by a panel of relationship experts who had already reached their verdict. During one particularly brutal coffee session, I overheard Maria comment on my simple life with an edge in her voice, while the others nodded in agreement like they were confirming a medical diagnosis. They would build on each other's observations and create these elaborate discussions about what Sarah deserved in life. While I stood there feeling like I was watching my own trial where the defense attorney had decided to join the prosecution team, I started feeling like I was losing my mind because I could sense the malicious intent behind their words, but I couldn't prove it to anyone, including myself, since they had perfected the art of plausible deniability. Every comment could be interpreted as helpful advice or genuine concern. And if I tried to explain to Sarah that her friends were systematically trying to undermine our marriage, I sounded paranoid and jealous rather than observant and protective. They had created the perfect trap where calling out their behavior made me look like the problem rather than the victim of their sophisticated psychological manipulation campaign. These women could make me feel guilty for questioning their motives by acting shocked and hurt that I would misinterpret their caring friendship as anything other than pure concern for Sarah's happiness. If I suggested that maybe their advice was inappropriate or their comments were hurtful, they would exchange glances and make sad faces and ask Sarah if I was always this defensive about constructive feedback. They turned my legitimate concerns about their interference into evidence that I was insecure and controlling, which somehow proved their point that Sarah deserved someone more emotionally mature and confident. The specific phrases they used were designed to plant doubt while maintaining complete deniability about their true intentions. And they had clearly practiced these techniques until they could deliver devastating critiques while sounding like supportive friends offering guidance. They would encourage Sarah to consider what her life would be like with someone more ambitious while making it sound like they were helping her explore her options, rather than systematically convincing her that I was inadequate. The setup made it sound like they were motivated by pure love and friendship, while the payoff systematically destroyed my reputation as a worthy husband. They exploited Sarah's trust and loyalty to get away with behavior that would have been completely unacceptable from strangers or casual acquaintances because they had established themselves as her closest friends who only wanted her best interests at heart. Sarah would never have tolerated this level of criticism about her marriage from coworkers or neighbors. But because these women had earned her trust and affection, she interpreted their attacks on me as evidence of how much they cared about her well-being. They used her friendship as a shield that protected them from consequences while they systematically poisoned her mind against me. Their strategy of death by 1,000 cuts was working exactly as planned because Sarah started expressing doubts about our marriage that perfectly matched the talking points her friends had been developing during months of weekly meetings. She began questioning things about our relationship that had never bothered her before, and using phrases that sounded suspiciously similar to the language these women used during their Tuesday afternoon evaluation sessions. I could see their influence spreading through her thoughts like a virus that was slowly but surely convincing her that she had made a terrible mistake by marrying someone as inadequate as me. What made their manipulation even more effective was how they had turned every interaction with me into an opportunity to gather evidence for their case against my worthiness as a husband. Every time I walked into a room where they were meeting, I could feel their eyes tracking my movements and cataloging my behavior for future discussion and analysis. The husband becomes a science experiment. They had transformed me into their primary research subject, and every Tuesday afternoon became another data collection session where these 4 behavioral scientists documented my inadequacy as husband material. The moment I entered the kitchen during their meetings, I could feel their attention shift from casual conversation to chemical observation as they analyzed how I moved, what I wore, and whether my facial expression provided useful evidence for their ongoing study of why Sarah had married beneath her social class. The migraine incident became their most valuable piece of research data because it gave them a perfect opportunity to observe me in a vulnerable state while simultaneously demonstrating their superior understanding of work-life balance. I had come home early from school with a splitting headache that made it impossible to focus on teaching teenagers about quadratic equations, and I just needed to lie down in a dark room until the pain subsided. But when I walked into our living room and found all 4 women sitting around our coffee table with their expensive purses and designer clothes, Maria immediately seized the moment to make her observation about how nice it must be for teachers to have such flexible schedules and be able to leave work early whenever they wanted. The way she delivered that comment while I stood there, obviously suffering from a legitimate medical condition, turned my pain into evidence of professional laziness and made it clear that these women viewed my career as an extended vacation rather than a demanding job that required patience, energy, and genuine care for young people who needed guidance and support. Rebecca nodded in agreement and added something about how her lawyer husband never gets to leave work early, no matter how he feels, because his clients depend on him, which somehow transformed my migraine into proof that I lacked the kind of professional dedication that Sarah deserved in a husband. Jessica contributed her own research findings by mentioning how her restaurant owner husband works through illness because small business owners can't afford to take time off, which made my decision to prioritize my health over staying at school sound like another example of the cushy lifestyle that teachers enjoy while real professionals make sacrifices for their families and their responsibilities. The 4 of them had turned my medical emergency into a case study about work ethic and professional commitment that somehow proved their point about my fundamental inadequacy as a provider. Their analysis of my birthday gift choices became another crucial piece of evidence in their research project about husband quality and relationship worthiness. When Sarah mentioned that I had given her a book of poetry for her birthday, Linda immediately asked what kind of jewelry I had gotten her to go with it. And when Sarah explained that the book was the entire gift, Linda got this expression like she was documenting the behavior of someone who clearly had no understanding of how to properly celebrate the woman he claimed to love. Maria added her professional opinion that thoughtful gifts usually involve some kind of financial investment that demonstrates how much the recipient means to the gift giver, which transformed my carefully chosen poetry collection into evidence of cheapness rather than thoughtfulness. The way they could turn any normal husband behavior into symptoms of deeper character flaws was honestly impressive in its thoroughness and creativity. If I seemed tired after work, they interpreted my exhaustion as lack of ambition, rather than the natural result of spending 8 hours managing classroom discipline and trying to make algebra interesting to students who would rather be anywhere else. If I appeared energetic and cheerful, they suggested my good mood proved I wasn't taking my responsibilities seriously enough and needed to develop a more mature understanding of what it meant to support a wife properly. Their questioning techniques became increasingly sophisticated as they tested different approaches to see which topics would produce the most useful responses to their comprehensive evaluation of my worthiness as Sarah's husband. Rebecca would ask about our weekend plans, and when I mentioned hiking, she would respond with observations about how outdoor activities are wonderful for people who enjoy simple pleasures, while making it clear that camping was what couples did when they couldn't afford real vacation experiences like wine country tours or European cruises. I started avoiding the kitchen during their Tuesday meetings, not because I was intimidated by their presence, but because I was exhausted by the constant feeling of being observed and analyzed like a laboratory specimen whose every action was being recorded for future reference. These women had created detailed mental files about my career limitations, my conversation topics, and my general approach to life. And they were building a comprehensive case that would eventually be presented to Sarah as scientific proof that she had settled for someone completely inadequate. The psychological toll of being constantly evaluated by researchers who had already written their conclusions about my species started affecting how I moved through my own house because I knew that every gesture and expression was being monitored for signs of inadequacy. Their methodology was producing exactly the kind of data they needed to support their hypothesis that Sarah had made a serious mistake by marrying someone so obviously beneath her standards and expectations. What I didn't realize at the time was that all their careful observation and documentation was building towards something much more devastating than just making me uncomfortable in my own home. These notes and behavioral analyses were being compiled into a comprehensive report that would soon be delivered to the one person whose opinion mattered most and whose loyalty I had always taken for granted. The wife's slow-motion betrayal. Sarah's transformation from loving wife to reluctant jury member happened gradually, which made it infinitely more painful because I got to witness every stage of her conversion, from my biggest supporter to someone who questioned whether I was worth defending. The shift became undeniable after the March coffee meeting when I overheard her wondering aloud to these women whether she might be happier with someone more ambitious than me. The woman who had once told me she loved that I chose teaching because I wanted to make a difference in kids' lives was now using their exact phrases to question whether my career choice was holding us back from achieving our full potential as a couple. She started parroting their talking points about financial security and lifestyle ambitions with an accuracy that made it clear she had been thoroughly programmed during their Tuesday afternoon sessions. Sarah would make comments about how some people are naturally more driven than others, or how important it is for couples to challenge each other toward greater achievements, and I could hear Becca's motivational speeches coming out of my wife's mouth. The most devastating part was watching her express dissatisfaction with aspects of our life that had never bothered her before these women convinced her that contentment was actually a form of settling for less than she deserved. Our weekend camping trips, which she had always enjoyed, suddenly became something to apologize for when her friends asked about our vacation plans. She started making excuses about how we were trying to save money for more important things rather than defending our choice to spend time outdoors together. Sarah began looking around our house with new eyes and making comments about how nice it would be to have granite countertops or hardwood floors like some of the other homes in our neighborhood. These observations came directly from Jessica's casual remarks about home improvement projects that apparently separated successful couples from those who were still struggling to achieve proper lifestyle standards. The moment I realized Sarah was starting to see me as the problem rather than her friends felt like getting punched in the stomach because I could see her mental loyalty shifting from our marriage toward their version of what her life should look like. She would get defensive when I suggested that maybe her friends were being inappropriate with their constant relationship advice, and she started treating my concerns about their interference as evidence that I was insecure and controlling rather than observant and protective. My legitimate worries about their manipulation were now being filtered through the lens they had provided, which painted me as the kind of husband who tried to isolate his wife from supportive friendships. What broke my heart was watching Sarah's attempts to maintain loyalty to both sides, while clearly being pulled toward their position. She would try to defend me in weak, half-hearted ways that actually made things worse by confirming their suspicions about our relationship problems. When they criticized my career choice, she would say things like, "He's a good person and he works hard." But the way she delivered these defenses sounded more like she was making excuses for my inadequacies, rather than celebrating my strengths as her chosen life partner. Her diplomatic responses that acknowledged their points had merit, or actually validation of their concerns. Because if I really was the amazing husband she claimed, then why wasn't she enthusiastically shutting down their criticisms? The coffee club had successfully convinced Sarah that being supportive meant helping me recognize my shortcomings and pushing me toward improvement, rather than accepting and appreciating me for who I already was. She started approaching our conversations like she was my life coach rather than my wife. And every discussion about our future felt like a performance review where I was constantly being measured against standards I had never agreed to meet. The woman who had once been proud of our ability to build a happy life on a modest income was now treating our financial limitations like a shameful secret that proved I wasn't the kind of partner who could help her achieve her full potential. Her friends had exploited Sarah's natural desire for growth by reframing those healthy impulses as evidence that she was trapped in a limiting relationship with someone who lacked ambition and vision for our shared future. They convinced her that wanting more from life meant she needed a different husband rather than simply working together toward common goals within our existing partnership. Rebecca and her crew had turned Sarah's dreams into weapons against our marriage by suggesting that achieving those dreams required replacing me with someone who could provide the kind of support and resources she deserved. The most telling sign that their conversion was complete came when Sarah stopped defending our choices and started apologizing for them instead. She would make excuses to her friends about why we couldn't afford expensive restaurants or weekend getaways, rather than explaining that we had different priorities and values that didn't revolve around impressing other people with our spending habits. The shift from pride in our life together to embarrassment about our circumstances marked the point where I knew these women had successfully recruited my wife to their cause. I could tell they were ready for the final phase of their operation because Sarah had begun asking me to run errands or stay late at school whenever they scheduled their Tuesday meetings. She no longer wanted me around during their discussions, which meant she was either protecting me from their criticism or protecting them from having to pretend they weren't systematically dismantling our marriage. Either way, her behavior confirmed that she now saw our relationship as something that needed to be managed and contained rather than celebrated and defended. The psychological warfare campaign had achieved its primary objective of turning my wife into an ally rather than an opponent in their systematic destruction of our marriage. What I didn't realize was that all their careful preparation and Sarah's gradual conversion had been building toward one final confrontation where they would drop their masks completely and deliver their verdict directly to my face. The intervention that wasn't. That confrontation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when I walked into what felt like a formal tribunal where 4 suburban housewives had appointed themselves as judges in a case I didn't even know was being tried. Rebecca sat at the head of our dining table like she was presiding over a corporate board meeting, and the other 3 women had arranged themselves around her in a formation that made it clear this was not going to be their typical gossip session about neighborhood drama and vacation planning. The theatrical nature of their staged intervention was honestly impressive in the most horrible way possible, because they had clearly rehearsed their roles and coordinated their talking points to present themselves as concerned friends rather than the marriage destroyers they had spent months training to become. Jessica had prepared a mental list of questions about my 5-year goals and long-term vision for providing Sarah with the lifestyle she deserved, while Maria sat there with her hands folded and this expression of deep concern that made it look like she was participating in a grief counseling session rather than orchestrating the systematic destruction of my relationship with my wife. They coordinated their attack with military precision and presented a united front of evidence about why I wasn't good enough for their friend that felt like watching a prosecution team deliver their closing arguments to a jury that had already decided I was guilty. Rebecca started by expressing how much they all cared about Sarah and wanted her to be happy, while Jessica jumped in with observations about how important it is for women to have partners who share their ambitions and vision for the future. Maria contributed her professional medical perspective about financial security, while Linda tied everything together with motivational speeches about not settling for less than you deserve in life and life. The shock of hearing my inadequacies listed out loud like charges in a courtroom was like getting hit by a truck, because these women had been collecting evidence against me for months, and now they were presenting their findings in a formal presentation, complete with supporting documentation and witness testimony. They had turned Sarah's private complaints about her modest vacation budget into proof that I was financially irresponsible, and her casual comments about wanting to redecorate into evidence that I wasn't ambitious enough to provide her with the kind of home she deserved as a woman of her caliber and social standing. The absurd formality of having my worth as a human being debated by a committee of suburban housewives who had appointed themselves as relationship experts was like something out of a satirical comedy about upper middle class social dynamics gone completely insane. These women were discussing my career, prospects, and personality traits with the same seriousness they would use to evaluate a job candidate or review a business proposal, and they had somehow convinced themselves that their opinions about my marriage carried the weight of professional consultation rather than neighborhood gossip disguised as friendship advice. The surreal experience of being told I wasn't good enough for my own wife by people who barely knew me beyond casual interactions during their weekly coffee meetings felt like stepping into an alternate universe where strangers had the authority to evaluate and grade my performance as a husband. Rebecca spoke about my teaching career like she was reviewing a failed business venture, while Jessica analyzed my communication style like she had a degree in marriage counseling and years of experience helping couples work through their relationship problems. These women delivered devastating personal attacks while maintaining the tone of a helpful book club discussion, and their ability to make character assassination sound like constructive feedback was honestly the most sophisticated manipulation technique I had ever witnessed in real life. They would say things like, "We feel like you're settling Sarah," while making it clear that I was the obstacle preventing her from achieving happiness and fulfillment in her personal and professional life. The way they used Sarah's private complaints and insecurities as evidence in their case against me was like watching someone's personal diary being read aloud in a public forum, where every vulnerable moment had been transformed into ammunition for destroying her marriage. They quoted conversations Sarah had shared with them about wanting to travel more or wishing we had a bigger house, and presented these normal relationship discussions as proof that she was desperately unhappy and trapped in a limiting situation with someone who couldn't provide the kind of life she really wanted. My growing realization that this moment had been planned and orchestrated rather than spontaneous made the whole experience even more devastating, because I understood that these women had been working toward this confrontation for months, while I thought they were just annoying neighbors who talked too much about money and status symbols. The coordination of their presentation and the way they had prepared specific examples and supporting evidence made it clear that this intervention was the culmination of a long-term strategy rather than a spontaneous expression of concern for Sarah's well-being. The careful timing of their attack, when Sarah was present to witness their verdict, ensured that she would hear their professional assessment of my inadequacy as a husband and life partner, which was obviously the whole point of their elaborate performance. They wanted her to see me through their eyes and understand that the concerns they had been expressing during months of coffee. Meetings were not just opinions, but objective facts about my failure to meet the standards required for someone who wanted to be married to a woman of her quality and potential. Jessica looked directly at me and delivered what felt like a preliminary statement in their case when she said that some people are just naturally more ambitious and driven than others, and that Sarah deserved to be with someone who could challenge her to grow and achieve more than she ever thought possible. The implication was crystal clear that I was not that person, and that my presence in Sarah's life was actually holding her back from becoming the woman she was meant to be. The setup for their final devastating blow was perfect because they had spent the entire meeting building their case and presenting their evidence, and now they were ready to deliver the verdict that would determine whether Sarah would finally understand what they had been trying to tell her for months. I could see Rebecca preparing to deliver what looked like the closing argument, and I found myself wondering what would happen next. Would Sarah defend me, or would she stay silent and let these women deliver their final judgment about classification system? Rebecca looked directly at me and delivered what felt like an official court ruling when she said, "You're not in her league," and honestly, she deserves so much better than this situation. The way she said it was like announcing that water is wet or that Tuesday comes after Monday. Just a simple statement of obvious fact that didn't require any discussion or debate, because clearly everyone in the room already understood this basic truth about my inadequacy as a human being. These women had somehow appointed themselves as commissioners of the human worth evaluation system, and they had spent months conducting their research before delivering their final assessment of my ranking in the relationship marketplace. The absurd concept of categorizing people into leagues like they were competing for different levels of social status was honestly one of the most ridiculous things I had ever witnessed in my adult life. But these women treated their classification system with the seriousness of professional analysts, breaking down performance statistics and compatibility metrics. According to their elaborate scoring system, my teaching career automatically placed me in some kind of lower category, while Sarah's potential and social connections qualified her for higher status, which created an obvious mismatch that needed immediate correction through strategic life changes and better partner selection decisions. Rebecca continued her league assessment presentation by explaining that successful relationships require partners who are evenly matched in terms of ambition, drive, and financial potential, because otherwise one person ends up carrying the entire burden while the other partner just coasts along without contributing their fair share to achieving life goals and social advancement. Jessica nodded in agreement and added that it was painful to watch such a talented person like Sarah being held back by someone who clearly didn't have the skills or work ethic required for competing at her level of excellence and achievement in their social circle. The devastating impact of being officially categorized as inferior by a panel of self-appointed relationship experts hit me like getting punched in the stomach, because months of subtle hints and indirect criticisms had suddenly crystallized into one undeniable statement that I was not good enough for my own wife. Maria jumped in with supporting observations about how teacher salaries compared to other professional careers and how that income disparity would only get worse over time, making it impossible for me to ever reach the kind of status that Sarah deserved in a romantic partner who could truly appreciate her value and potential for social mobility. Linda delivered the final blow by explaining that staying in a mismatched relationship was actually unfair to both people, because it prevented the higher status partner from reaching their full potential while forcing the lower status partner to constantly struggle with inadequacy and self-doubt about their performance. She made it sound like she was offering compassionate relationship counseling rather than destroying my marriage. But the message was crystal clear that I needed to accept my classification and step aside so Sarah could find someone more suitable for her social level and lifestyle aspirations. The ridiculous criteria these women used to determine league status and relationship value was based entirely on superficial measurements like annual salary, vacation destinations, and the square footage of your house, rather than anything meaningful like character loyalty or how well you treated your spouse during difficult times. According to their evaluation system, a person's worth as a romantic partner could be calculated using the same metrics you would use to compare luxury purchases or investment opportunities, which explained why they spent so much time discussing price tags and status symbols during their weekly assessment meetings. Sarah's reaction to hearing her friends explicitly state what they had been implying for months about her husband was the most heartbreaking part of this entire experience, because I watched her face for any sign that she would defend me or tell them they were wrong. But instead, she just sat there, nodding slightly, like she was finally hearing someone say out loud what she had been thinking privately. The woman who had once told me she loved that I chose teaching because it showed I cared more about making a difference than making money was now listening to her friends explain why that career choice proved I wasn't ambitious enough for someone with her potential and social standing. These women delivered their crushing verdict with the casual confidence of weather forecasters announcing tomorrow's conditions, because in their minds, they were simply stating obvious facts about social hierarchies and relationship compatibility rather than destroying someone's self-esteem and marriage with their amateur psychology analysis. Rebecca explained that recognizing league differences wasn't meant to be hurtful, but was actually a helpful reality check that would allow both people to find more appropriate matches within their respective social categories and lifestyle expectations. The moment when I realized that Sarah's silence was actually her agreement with their assessment felt like watching my biggest supporter join the opposing team right in the middle of the game, because her lack of defense meant she had already accepted their evaluation of my worth as her husband. She wasn't remaining neutral or trying to avoid conflict. She was tacitly endorsing the professional opinion that I belonged in a completely different category than the one she deserved to occupy for the rest of her life. Jessica continued the league analysis by pointing out specific examples of how our lifestyle differences proved we were mismatched, including our modest vacation budget, our older car, and our inability to keep up with the social activities that someone of Sarah's caliber should be enjoying with a partner who could provide the appropriate level of financial support and cultural sophistication. She made it sound like she was reviewing evidence to identify obvious compatibility errors, rather than criticizing normal, middle-class lifestyle choices. This phrase, about not being in Sarah's league, became the final nail in the coffin of a marriage that had been slowly poisoned by outside interference, because it transformed months of subtle manipulation into one concrete statement that couldn't be misinterpreted or explained away as friendly concern. The coffee club had successfully completed their mission of convincing my wife that she had married beneath her station, and that correcting this mistake was essential for her future happiness and personal development, as someone who clearly deserved better than what she had settled for. The shock hit me like a physical blow, and I felt this lump forming in my throat as the words sank in, and I looked desperately at Sarah, waiting for her to say something, anything that would prove these women wrong about where her loyalty lay. And that silence sealed our fate. The silent treatment that spoke volumes. Sarah just sat there staring at her coffee cup like it contained the secrets of the universe, while these women systematically destroyed my reputation as a worthy husband right in front of her. The silence that filled our living room after Rebecca delivered her league assessment verdict was so loud it could have registered on seismic equipment, because sometimes the most devastating betrayals come not from what people say, but from what they refuse to say when you need them most. I kept waiting for Sarah to interrupt their presentation with something like, "Hey, wait a minute. These are my friends, but they don't get to talk about my husband like this." Or maybe, "Ladies, I think you've crossed a line here and need to back off." But instead, she just nodded slightly when Patricia made her comment about how some people are naturally more ambitious than others. That tiny movement of her head was like watching someone sign a confession, because it confirmed everything these women had been saying about me during months of coffee club programming. The tension in that moment was incredible, because I found myself desperately waiting for my wife to remember that she was supposed to be on my team, rather than serving as a silent witness to my character assassination by a panel of suburban relationship experts. Rebecca and her crew kept glancing at Sarah between their critical observations about my career, prospects, and lifestyle choices, clearly expecting her to contribute her own examples of my shortcomings. But her continued silence was somehow even more damaging than if she had actively joined their attack. My growing realization that Sarah had already made her choice, and it wasn't me, hit like getting sucker punched by someone you trusted completely, because the woman who had once been my biggest supporter was now sitting there like a spectator at a boxing match where she was secretly rooting for the other fighter to win by knockout. Her attempt to avoid taking sides was actually the most decisive way of taking sides possible, because neutrality in the face of an attack is really just cowardice disguised as diplomacy. The most devastating part of watching my wife transform into a silent observer of my public humiliation was understanding that this betrayal cut deeper than anything these women could have said about my career or personality, because the person who was supposed to love and protect me had chosen to remain neutral while strangers attacked everything I represented as her life partner. Jessica could deliver speeches about ambition and drive and settling for less than you deserve, while Sarah sat there like she was receiving valuable life coaching rather than watching her marriage get destroyed by people who barely knew us as a couple. Her silence gave her friends permission to continue their assault and validated everything they had been saying during months of weekly strategy sessions. Because if Sarah really disagreed with her assessment of my worth as a husband, she would have spoken up immediately, rather than letting them spend 20 minutes explaining why I was holding her back from achieving her full potential. Maria could list statistics about teacher retirement planning and career advancement opportunities while looking directly at Sarah for confirmation. And Sarah's refusal to defend our financial choices was basically an endorsement of their position that we were living beneath the standards she deserved. My understanding that a spouse who won't defend you against attackers has already joined the other team became crystal clear when I realized that Sarah's silence was actually more hurtful than if she had openly criticized me herself, because at least direct confrontation would have been honest about where she stood, instead of this cowardly approach of letting her friends do the dirty work while she maintained plausible deniability about her own feelings. The woman who had once told me she would always have my back was now demonstrating that she would rather sit quietly and let other people tear me down than risk disappointing her new friends by defending her own life. Rebecca finished her presentation about lead classifications and relationship compatibility standards and then looked directly at Sarah like she was waiting for official confirmation that the verdict had been accepted and understood by all parties involved in this divorce proceeding disguised as an intervention. Sarah's continued silence in that moment was her signature on the divorce papers because she had just allowed 4 women to convince her that she had married beneath her station and needed to make better choices if she wanted to live the kind of life she really deserved. The realization that this betrayal was unforgivable and irreversible hit me like a lightning strike, because there are some lines that can't be uncrossed and some silences that can't be explained away as temporary confusion or social awkwardness. Sarah had chosen to prioritize her friendships with these women over loyalty to her husband, and that decision revealed something fundamental about her character that no amount of marriage counseling or heart-to-heart conversations could ever fix, because she had shown me exactly who she really was when the pressure was on. I looked at my wife sitting there in her own living room, refusing to defend the man she had promised to love and honor for better or worse. And I understood that she had already made her choice about our future together, and I was not part of the plan she was developing with her new advisory board of relationship consultants. These women had convinced her that trading up was not only possible but necessary for her personal growth and happiness. And Sarah's silence had just confirmed that she was ready to follow their advice, regardless of what it would cost our marriage. The weight of that moment settled over me like a heavy blanket, because I finally understood that continuing to fight for someone who wouldn't fight for me was just another form of self-destruction, and I deserved better than spending the rest of my life trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I wasn't good enough. At that moment, I realized there was only one thing left for me to do: the Great Escape and its aftermath. I walked upstairs and started packing my clothes into 2 suitcases while Sarah sat in the living room processing what had just happened during her friend's intervention that had turned into my resignation from a marriage I never wanted to quit. The sound of my dresser drawers opening and closing must have finally convinced her. This wasn't just a dramatic gesture, because she appeared in the doorway asking what I was doing, like the answer wasn't completely obvious. I grabbed my books from the nightstand and my coffee mug from the kitchen counter and loaded everything into my car while she followed me to the driveway, asking where I was going and when I would be back. Her shock that I was actually leaving, instead of trying harder to prove my worth to her friends, was almost comical, because she seemed genuinely surprised that someone would choose to walk away rather than continue subjecting themselves to systematic humiliation disguised as helpful advice. The woman who had just sat silently while her friends explained why I belonged in a different league than her was now confused about why I didn't want to stay and continue playing their rigged game where I was always the loser. She kept asking if we could talk about this tomorrow, like sleeping on it would somehow change the fact that she had chosen her coffee club over her husband when it mattered most. The relief I felt while loading my car was honestly surprising, because I had expected to feel devastated about leaving the house we had bought together and the life we had built over 8 years of marriage. Instead, I felt like someone who had finally escaped from a job where every day involved performance reviews conducted by people who had already decided I was incompetent and needed constant improvement to meet their standards. The weight of constantly being evaluated and found wanting by Rebecca and her crew had been crushing my spirit for months, and suddenly, I was free from their weekly assessments of my worth as a human being. Walking away became an act of self-preservation rather than giving up on our relationship, because I finally understood that you cannot save a marriage when only one person is willing to defend it against outside attacks. Sarah had made her choice during that horrible silence when her friends delivered their league assessment, and she chose to remain quiet instead of telling them they were wrong or asking them to leave our house immediately. The woman who had once promised to have my back in any situation had just demonstrated that she would rather sit there like a passive observer while strangers destroyed her husband's reputation than risk disappointing her new advisory committee. Rebecca and her coffee club cronies probably celebrated their successful mission that evening while pretending to comfort Sarah about her husband's dramatic overreaction to their caring intervention, because they had gotten exactly what they wanted without having to admit they had been trying to destroy our marriage from the beginning. I could picture them sitting around someone's granite countertop, explaining to Sarah that my departure proved all their points about my character and maturity level, while offering to help her navigate the exciting world of dating men who were actually in her league and could provide the lifestyle she deserved. The freedom from constant judgment that I experienced after leaving was like getting released from prison after serving time for crimes. I didn't commit because these women had turned my own home into a courtroom where I was perpetually on trial for the offense of being insufficiently impressive for their friend. No more Tuesday afternoon tribunals where my career choices and weekend plans were analyzed for evidence of inadequacy, and no more conversations where everything I said was interpreted as proof that Sarah had settled for less than she deserved when she married me. My departure exposed the true nature of these friendships and revealed that they were built on a foundation of competition and superiority rather than genuine care for Sarah's well-being. Because friends who really wanted her to be happy would have encouraged her to work on her marriage instead of convincing her to abandon it. The coffee club had operated like a toxic support group where the main activity involved tearing down other people's relationships to make themselves feel better about their own lives. And Sarah had chosen to join their destructive game instead of protecting what we had built together. The long-term impact of choosing toxic friends over a loyal spouse played out exactly as I expected, because Sarah discovered that her new advisory committee was more interested in drama than actually helping her find happiness in her next relationship. These women, who had spent months explaining why I wasn't good enough for her, would eventually turn their critical analysis toward whatever new men entered her life, because their hobby was finding fault with other people's choices rather than celebrating their friends' happiness. 6 months after I moved out, I heard through mutual friends that Sarah was struggling with dating and feeling lonely, while her coffee club continued their weekly meetings, where they probably discussed her romantic prospects with the same level of inappropriate involvement they had shown in evaluating my worth as her husband. The women who had convinced her that she deserved better than a stable marriage with someone who loved her were now watching her learn that finding someone better is significantly more difficult than destroying what you already have. Jessica and Maria and Linda had gotten exactly what they wanted, but now they had to deal with the consequences of their successful campaign to convince Sarah that she needed to upgrade her husband, because destroying someone else's marriage is easier than maintaining your own happiness. These women would eventually have to watch Sarah navigate the dating world as a divorced woman in her 30s, while pretending they had nothing to do with ending her 8-year relationship with someone who actually loved and supported her before they entered the picture with their league classifications and lifestyle comparisons. Driving away from that house, for the last time, I realized I was regaining more than just physical space. I was reclaiming my dignity from people who had spent months trying to convince me I wasn't worthy of basic respect from my own wife. The most devastating part of this entire experience wasn't losing my marriage, but discovering that the person I had trusted most in the world was willing to let strangers attack me while she sat there offering no defense or protection. But as painful as that realization was, it also revealed something important about the difference between people who build others up and people who tear them down. The most important lesson from this entire experience is understanding that when people spend their time trying to convince you that you're not good enough, They're revealing everything about their own character rather than exposing any truth about your worth. Rebecca and her coffee club crew showed me exactly who they were through their campaign to destroy my marriage, and Sarah demonstrated her true priorities when she chose silence while they attacked the man she promised to protect. Moving into my new condo and rebuilding my life away from their constant judgment brought a peace I hadn't felt in years. I discovered I was genuinely happier without people who had already decided I wasn't good enough and spent their energy trying to prove it. If you've ever faced judgment from outsiders in your own home, share your story below and subscribe for more real-life drama that proves sometimes walking away is the strongest thing you can do.